I've made quite a few videos about Honda's race bikes, especially from the 60s, and some of the amazing production motorcycles that came out of that race development, but this one probably takes the cake for being the craziest. Honda's bold move into motorcycle racing in the late 50s and then their four-stroke dominance in the early and mid-60s was marked by just as bold a move out of motorcycle racing in the late 60s to focus on car production, which is great for those of us who drive a Honda, but sad for Grand Prix racing fans in the 70s. And while Honda was gone, the simplest way to define their absence in racing was the two-stroke takeover. The very first 500cc class win by a two-stroke happened in 1971, but it wasn't until 75 that a two-stroke would win the Premier class, and that was really the beginning of the end for the four-stroke race bikes, especially from companies like MV Agusta. This was a sort of changing of the guard, so to speak, and by the late 70s, nothing could touch the big, loud, smoky two-strokes. So when Honda, the four-stroke king, announced that they would return to Grand Prix racing in 1977, people were shocked. Honda set out once again to compete with the two-strokes, this time the big two-strokes, by making a high-revving four-stroke race bike, higher revving than ever before. And this was the NR500, with NR standing for New Racing. Now, if you remember from our video about the Honda CBX, the designer of that engine was also given charge of this engine, Soichiro Irimajiri, an absolute legend in the history of Honda engine development. Irimajiri was also partnered with a young graduate named Suguru Kanazawa, along with about 100 others, and their primary goal was to make a four-stroke 500cc race bike that could rev up to 22,000 RPM. See, Honda was in a difficult place. The only way that they would be able to compete with the big two-strokes from the likes of Suzuki, for example, would be to rev the machine out more than any big four-stroke had ever revved. Honda had no interest in reinventing the wheel at this point with another two-stroke platform. For them, it just didn't feel like an option, so they decided to continue their sort of pursuit of higher revving four-strokes. So two things needed to be increased: engine speed and valve area. So Irimajiri decided to do something that had never been done, which is to utilize oval pistons so as to double the amount of valves. Essentially, more valves meant more air and fuel mixture, which meant higher compression, which meant more power. At least that was the idea. The regulations for 500cc racing at this point limited the amount of cylinders that a four-stroke race bike could have, but not the actual form of the cylinder. This hadn't mattered. Nobody had thought of utilizing anything but, a circle piston. So first, Irimajiri tested the idea out by making basically a single cylinder engine with an oval piston just to see how it worked, and the results were at least sufficient enough for them to proceed with this idea. Now, the NR500 was a water-cooled double overhead cam V4, with the V being at 100 degrees instead of the typical 90 to make room essentially for the carburetors. The pistons themselves weren't quite oval. Instead, they were essentially two straight sides and then two curved ends. The cylinders themselves required two conrods to function, so the bike had 8 valves on each cylinder, essentially turning the bike into a V8 with a total of, you guessed it, 32 valves and 8 conrods. The CBX thought it was cool with 24 valves, and they posted that all over the bike. This bike had 2 cylinders less and 8 more valves. The valves were arranged in 2 rows of 4 over each piston. Now, the first running iteration of the NR500 engine wasn't complete until early 79, which was about 2 years after their announcement of returning to racing, and it produced a sad 80 horsepower at only 14,000 RPM. That's about 40 less horsepower than the winning 500cc two-strokes from this era. Shortly after this, though, the engine was tweaked, and once it was put into the actual chassis, it was making about 100 horsepower at 17,000 RPM. Better, but really still not enough to compete with the two-strokes. Now, the chassis for the NR500 was just about as crazy as the motor. A monocoque frame made entirely out of sheet aluminum, holding the engine as a stressed member, as well as being a mount for the side-mounted radiator. In theory, great, but for service, not so much. Getting to the carburetors on this bike was nearly impossible. The bike was unconventional at every turn. External springs for the upside-down forks, along with offset fork tubes, with the brakes mounted in front of the fork, The bike was ready in time for the last 2 Grand Prix races of the '79 season, and the results were pretty abysmal, with DNFs all around and unbelievably slow lap times. Power was increased between races to 108 horsepower, but the bike had many deficiencies, the worst being this aluminum frame and its tendency to just crack and break under load. Now, going into the 1980 season, the biggest change was related to the bike's chassis. Essentially, they ditched the monocoque frame for a more conventional tubular steel frame, still using the engine as a stress member. The radiator was moved to the front, and then traditional Marzocchi front forks replaced the upside-down forks from the previous iteration. Valve work was done to increase the power, and now the bike was getting, more competitive with the two strokes with a power output of 118 horsepower at 19,000 RPM. Honda just slowly continued to eke revs and horsepower out of this platform with increased valve size. Now, the NR500 still had very little success in 1980, causing most to pretty much have little faith in this platform, but Honda just kept developing the platform, and for the '81 season, we would actually see the NR500 win a race, which happened at Suzuka. Now, this wasn't a Grand Prix race, this was a national race, and we won't talk about the fact that this win really only came about because Honda decided to take one less pit stop. But in all, despite being a technological tour de force, the NR500 never won a single Grand Prix race and would eventually be replaced by Honda's two-stroke NS500. Now, the story of the NR500 is interesting, and without it, we wouldn't have the production motorcycle that we're looking at right now. But it's this next iteration of Honda's 32-valve oval piston platform that's really interesting and odd to me, and it happens on the production side. So this is the Honda NR, the production iteration of Honda's V4 oval piston motorcycle, and it happens to be one of the single most collectible Honda motorcycles and just sport bikes in general. It's hard to really understand why Honda would keep doing anything with this configuration. The NR500 was by all standards a total failure for the company in their foray back into racing, and really an embarrassment for them, especially coming off of their dominance in the 60s. So the idea that they would keep making the NR in any form seems really baffling, but more on that in a bit. Now, the production NR, or NR750 as it's commonly misnamed, comes obviously from the NR500, but also what was initially an endurance racer used by Honda at the 24-hour Le Mans, but only making it about 3 hours. And then also having one single race victory, just like the NR500. Now, in 1992, Honda released the first production version of this motorcycle, the NR, a 750cc oval piston sport bike with essentially the same sort of makeup of the original NR500, though the main difference was the pistons themselves. Whereas the 500cc race version had rounded ends and straight sides, the NR had curved sides, making it actually even more closer to being a real oval. The NR featured loads of tech for its day for a production bike, including the first ever slipper clutch coming from NR's race bike history, and something that was called a back torque limiter. That was an innovation that was needed due to the V4's incredibly powerful engine braking, which would then cause slippage. The NR was the first Japanese production bike to feature fuel injection, upside-down forks, magnesium wheels. Many of the features that are present on the NR 750 and that caused it to be so exclusive and expensive are common today, but they weren't in 1992, and for this reason, most who experience the bike today actually do find it very modern. The fit and finish of the bike was something entirely new, and because of that, you really did pay for it. This was the single most expensive street bike ever at $50,000 in 1992, and for reference, that's over $100K today. So basically, it was the Superleggera of its day, and just about 300 or so were made for 1992, and a few more in 1993, but none of these were ever sold, as far as I know, in the United States. In terms of performance, the bike was, I guess, interesting. I think that's the simplest way to put it. The short stroke oval piston design left the rider with a massive power band, but not really any more usable power than the contemporary Honda VFR 750, which was also a V4, but, without all the craziness and goofiness. Essentially, it had regular pistons, not oval pistons. And some deemed the VFR the poor man's NR, but it really was pretty much just as good a sport bike in every regard. Sure, the NR was faster in the long straights and at the top end, but not really faster in overall times. But when you bought the NR, you weren't paying for performance per se. It's not exactly like a modern Superleggera, which truly is faster than a regular V4. No, you were paying for something unique, something exotic, on a level never seen from Japanese manufacturers. This bike was much more like a rare Italian bike, say a Desmosedici RR, and it also happened to be very red. Now, unlike some of the other really unique Hondas that we've covered on this channel, like say the CBX or CB354, which were both born out of race success, the NR was born out of race failure, a relentless pursuit of something that many would call silly. Even some of those who worked on the original NR500 race bike look back and wonder if it was all just kind of foolish ambitions. Oval pistons used to essentially double the cylinder capacity doesn't actually work. A V4 with oval pistons doesn't turn into a V8, any more than a V-twin with oval pistons would turn into a V4. This is why the oval piston design was abandoned and never really tried ever again by anybody. But this doesn't mean that all was lost in Honda's venture to take on the two-strokes. The production NR is a perfect example. Today, slipper clutches and upside-down forks are common, affordable options, but they wouldn't exist if companies like Honda and others wouldn't be willing to actually put those crazy features on a motorcycle to see if riders actually wanted them. Even in terms of overall design, the NR750 helped inspire the likes of Massimo Tamburini as he was working on the 916 when the NR was unveiled. Without the NR, the 916 wouldn't have, for example, underswept exhaust. This was a really influential bike. But I think the best way to define Honda's NR program is a failure, sure, but the right kind of failure. No other company in motorcycle history has approached engine design with the same kind of bold, almost childlike faith as Honda. The NR platform may not have been as successful as, say, Honda's first endeavor into multi-cylinder four-stroke technology in the late 50s and the early 60s, but it was arguably a more audacious one. The idea that a major company would just decide to change the shape of their pistons is just outrageous. I mean, when you look at it objectively, imagine a company doing something like that today. We just don't see stuff like this. And for that reason, when Honda released the production NR, it was a celebration not so much of racing success or pedigree, but more a celebration of a spirit, an approach to motorcycle design and development that really was unrivaled by any other company, even if it meant failure. I think it's important to understand the purpose of motorcycles like the NR. It's easy to look at a Superleggera or the original Yamaha R7 or, say, the Ducati Desmosedici RR. These motorcycles are more than just the sum of their parts. Yeah, they'll probably never be owned or ridden by regular riders like you and I, but their impact goes beyond just the bikes themselves. In a way, anybody riding a new sport bike today is reaping the benefits of projects like the NR, even if it doesn't mean that, every motorcycle uses oval pistons. And when you look at it that way, I think it's a lot easier to see why Honda would celebrate a failure like the NR.